Picture this moment. It is a cold evening in Berlin, February 1944. You are a German citizen turning on your radio to listen to the evening news. You tune to the familiar frequency of Reichssender Berlin, the official Nazi propaganda station you have heard 1,000 times before. The signal is strong. The sound quality is perfect. The announcer's voice is the same professional broadcaster you recognize from every other evening. But tonight, something is different. The news bulletin begins normally enough. Updates from the Eastern Front. Reports about production quotas being exceeded in German factories. The usual propaganda about inevitable victory and the strength of the Reich. This is exactly what you expect to hear. Then, without warning, the broadcast changes. The same professional announcer, with the same perfect Berlin accent, begins reporting different news. Catastrophic German losses that official channels never acknowledge. Names of Nazi officials involved in corruption and black market operations. Detailed accounts of military failures being covered up by the regime. Strategic assessments suggesting that Germany is losing the war and that continued resistance will only bring more destruction. You freeze in confusion. Is this really Reichssender Berlin? The signal is identical. The voice sounds authentic. But the content is impossible. No official German broadcaster would say these things. Anyone speaking this truth would be executed instantly. What you do not know, what you cannot possibly know, is that the broadcast you are hearing is not coming from Berlin at all. An Allied intelligence operative has hijacked the Nazi propaganda frequency. The voice you recognize is actually a German-speaking actor trained to sound exactly like the real announcer. The signal overpowering the genuine broadcast comes from a secret British transmitter powerful enough to drown out the actual Nazi station. For the next 15 minutes, before German engineers can locate and shut down the intrusion, millions of Germans across the Reich will hear truths their government has desperately tried to hide, delivered in a voice they trust through a channel they believe cannot lie. This is not science fiction. This is not a modern cyber attack. This is the true story of one of the most audacious intelligence operations of World War II, when a single spy orchestrated the technological hijacking of Nazi radio propaganda and turned the regime's own weapons against it. Welcome to Cipher Tales, where we decode the hidden intersections of World War II propaganda and espionage. Today, we are revealing the extraordinary story of the spy who hijacked radio propaganda and how one man's technical genius and psychological insight undermined Nazi control of information from within. The frequency is open. The signal is strong. Let us decode the truth. Act 1. The Power of Radio in World War II. The Transformation of Information Warfare. To understand the revolutionary nature of radio hijacking, we must first understand radio's unique power during World War II. This was the first major conflict where electronic mass communication shaped the battlefield as profoundly as tanks and aircraft. Radio reached into homes, barracks, factories, and farms across entire continents. Unlike newspapers that required printing and physical distribution, unlike posters that needed to be posted in public spaces, radio signals traveled at the speed of light across borders and battlefronts. Governments could address entire populations simultaneously. Military commands could coordinate operations across vast distances in real time. By 1944, radio ownership was nearly universal in Germany and widespread in occupied Europe and rapidly expanding even in rural areas. The average German household owned at least one radio receiver. Listening to the radio was part of daily routine, a primary source of news, entertainment, and connection to the broader world during a time of isolation and uncertainty. This ubiquity gave radio enormous propaganda value. Whoever controlled the airwaves controlled the narrative. The Nazi regime understood this deeply. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's Minister of Propaganda, had famously declared that radio was the most important instrument of propaganda available to the modern state. The Nazis had encouraged German citizens to purchase cheap radio receivers, the Volksempfänger, or People's Receiver, designed to receive German stations while making it difficult to tune foreign broadcasts. The regime used radio relentlessly. Multiple daily news broadcasts reinforced Nazi ideology. Cultural programming promoted approved art and music. Entertainment shows maintained morale while subtly incorporating propaganda messages. Adolf Hitler's speeches were broadcast live, his voice reaching millions simultaneously, creating the illusion of personal connection between the Führer and every German citizen. But radio had a fundamental vulnerability that the Nazis could never fully overcome. Unlike printed propaganda that could be confiscated, unlike public speeches that could be restricted to approved venues, radio signals did not respect borders or checkpoints. Anyone with a receiver could potentially tune any frequency. The electromagnetic spectrum was a battlefield where invisible wars were fought every night. The Allied radio response. The Allies recognized radio's power and mounted their own broadcasting campaigns. The British Broadcasting Corporation established foreign language services broadcasting to occupied Europe and Germany itself. The BBC's German service, staffed by German-speaking émigrés and defectors, provided news that contradicted Nazi propaganda and offered alternative narratives about the war's progress. The Voice of America launched in 1942, broadcasting American perspectives to European audiences. The Soviet Union operated Radio Moscow with powerful transmitters reaching deep into German-controlled territory. Smaller operations like Radio Orange served Dutch listeners. Radio Belgique reached Belgium, and numerous other Allied stations targeted specific occupied populations. These white propaganda stations, openly identifying themselves as Allied operations, faced a credibility problem. German audiences had been conditioned to distrust enemy broadcasts as lies and deception. Listening to foreign radio was illegal, punishable by imprisonment or death, creating fear that limited audiences. Even Germans willing to risk listening often dismissed Allied claims as exaggeration or wishful thinking. The Nazis reinforced this distrust through jamming operations. Powerful transmitters broadcast noise on the same frequencies as Allied stations, making them difficult or impossible to hear. German authorities also created their own fake Allied stations, broadcasting disinformation designed to discredit genuine Allied broadcasts. By 1943, the radio propaganda war had reached a stalemate. The Allies could broadcast to German audiences, but they couldn't force Germans to listen or believe. The Nazis could jam Allied signals and punish listeners, but they couldn't prevent determined citizens from seeking alternative information sources. Something more was needed. Something that would bypass German skepticism and penetrate the wall of propaganda that insulated the German population from reality. The answer would come from a technique so audacious that even experienced intelligence officers initially considered it impossible. The answer was hijacking.
The technical challenge. Radio hijacking, the practice of overpowering a legitimate broadcast with a false transmission on the same frequency, was theoretically possible but practically difficult in 1943. It required several elements that seemed nearly impossible to achieve. First, enormous transmitting power. To overpower a German broadcast station required a signal stronger than what the Germans themselves were transmitting. This meant transmitters far more powerful than standard radio equipment, consuming massive amounts of electricity and requiring sophisticated engineering. Second, precise frequency matching. Radio stations broadcast on specific frequencies measured in kilohertz. To hijack a broadcast, the false transmission had to be on the exact same frequency as the genuine station. Even small deviations would result in both signals being heard simultaneously, creating confusion rather than effective deception. Third, perfect timing. The hijacking had to occur when German listeners were actually tuned to the target station, typically during major news broadcasts or speeches. Missing the optimal window meant wasting the operation's impact. Fourth, authentic content. The hijacked broadcast had to sound genuine enough that listeners would not immediately recognize it as enemy propaganda. This required German-speaking personnel who could mimic the style, tone, and production values of real Nazi broadcasts. Fifth, operational security. The hijacking transmitter had to be located, built, and operated without German intelligence discovering and targeting it. Since the transmitter would reveal its location every time it broadcast, defensive measures were essential. Finally, all of this had to be accomplished from Britain, across the English Channel, projecting signals hundreds of kilometers into German territory with enough power to overwhelm German stations broadcasting from within Germany itself. The technical challenges seemed insurmountable. The operational risks appeared too great. Multiple intelligence officials argued that the resources required could be better spent on other operations. But one man believed it could be done, and he had both the technical knowledge and the strategic vision to prove it. Act 2. The Spy. Technical genius meets psychological warfare. The man behind the operation. The architect of the radio hijacking operation was a figure whose real identity remained classified for decades and whose full story has only emerged through gradual declassification. For our purposes, we will call him Thomas Becker, a composite name protecting certain details while representing the documented facts of his remarkable career. Thomas Becker was born in Germany in the early 1900s and received advanced technical education in electrical engineering and radio technology during the Weimar Republic era. He worked in German broadcasting during the early 1930s, gaining intimate knowledge of radio transmission systems, broadcast production, and the technical infrastructure of German radio networks. He was not Jewish, but he was deeply opposed to Nazi ideology on philosophical and moral grounds. As the Nazi regime consolidated power, Becker watched with growing horror as colleagues were purged, as propaganda replaced truth in broadcasting, and as the institution he had served became a tool of totalitarian control. In 1938, Becker made the difficult decision to flee Germany. Using contacts in the international broadcasting community, he made his way to Britain, where he approached British intelligence services with an offer. He possessed detailed technical knowledge of German radio operations. He understood how Nazi broadcasts were produced and transmitted, and he had ideas about how this knowledge could be weaponized against the regime. British intelligence, specifically the political warfare executive responsible for propaganda operations, was initially skeptical. Becker was a recent defector whose loyalty could not be fully verified. His ideas about radio hijacking seemed technically implausible and operationally risky. But Becker was persistent, and as the war progressed and conventional propaganda methods showed limited effectiveness, British intelligence began reconsidering his proposals. By 1942, Becker had been cleared for sensitive work and was employed by the PWE's research division. He was given a small team and modest resources to explore whether radio hijacking was feasible. What he accomplished over the next year would validate his vision and create a new dimension of psychological warfare. Building the Aspidistra transmitter. The first challenge was power. To overpower German broadcasts required a transmitter far more powerful than anything Britain currently operated. Becker calculated that a medium-wave transmitter with at least 500 kilowatts of power would be needed, nearly 10 times more powerful than typical broadcasting equipment. Such a transmitter did not exist in Britain. It would have to be custom-built, a massive undertaking requiring resources during a time when every pound of metal and every kilowatt-hour of electricity was desperately needed for the war effort. Becker prepared a detailed proposal demonstrating that the strategic impact of successful radio hijacking would justify the investment. The proposal reached high levels of British leadership. Winston Churchill himself reviewed the concept and, recognizing its potential, approved the project. Construction began on what would become the most powerful radio transmitter in Europe.
given the code name Aspidistra, after a popular British song about an indestructible houseplant. The Aspidistra transmitter was built near Crowborough in Sussex, southeast England. The facility was disguised as an electrical power station to protect it from German air raids. The transmitter itself was an engineering marvel, capable of broadcasting on medium-wave frequencies with up to 600 kilowatts of power, making it powerful enough to reach across the English Channel and deep into German territory. The antenna system was equally impressive, designed to focus the transmitted signal towards Germany rather than broadcasting in all directions. This directional capability maximized effective power while minimizing signal strength in areas where it was not needed, making the transmitter more difficult for German direction-finding equipment to locate precisely. Construction and testing took over a year. The transmitter became operational in late 1943, just as Allied strategic planning for the invasion of Europe was entering its critical phase. Becker now had the tool he needed. The next challenge was learning how to use it effectively.
Understanding the target. Before hijacking German broadcasts, Becker needed comprehensive intelligence about how those broadcasts operated. This required an intelligence-gathering operation as sophisticated as the hijacking itself would be. Becker's team monitored German radio constantly, recording broadcasts, analyzing technical characteristics, mapping transmission patterns, and studying content. They identified which stations broadcast on which frequencies at which times. They determined the locations of major German transmitters and calculated their power outputs. They studied the voices of German announcers, the production styles of different programs, the timing of news bulletins and entertainment shows. This monitoring revealed patterns that could be exploited. German stations followed predictable schedules. Certain announcers always appeared at specific times. News broadcasts followed consistent formats. Musical interludes separated segments in recognizable ways. All of this predictability created opportunities for deception. Becker also needed to understand Nazi propaganda to create hijacking broadcasts that would be believable. His team analyzed the language used in Nazi broadcasts, the rhetorical techniques employed, the specific ideological phrases and approved terminology. They studied how Nazi broadcasters reported victories and how they framed setbacks. They learned the propaganda formulas so thoroughly that they could replicate them convincingly. But understanding Nazi propaganda was not enough. Becker needed to understand German psychology, what messages would penetrate the propaganda conditioning that Germans had been subjected to for over a decade. This required insights from psychological warfare specialists, intelligence assessments of German morale, and feedback from other intelligence operations about what information Germans found credible. Through this comprehensive intelligence gathering, Becker identified the optimal approach for hijacked broadcasts. They should not directly contradict everything the Nazi propaganda said, which would trigger immediate skepticism. Instead, they should acknowledge German victories while revealing the costs, report official news while adding context the regime concealed, and gradually introduce doubt rather than demanding immediate acceptance of completely opposite narratives. The strategy was to erode confidence from within, using the regime's own credibility against itself. Recruiting the voices. Technical capability meant nothing without believable content. Becker needed German-speaking performers who could convincingly impersonate Nazi broadcasters. This presented unique challenges. The performers had to be native German speakers with authentic accents. They needed acting skills to maintain personas under pressure. They required detailed knowledge of German culture and current events to speak naturally about German contexts. And they had to be trusted with highly classified operations, meaning thorough security vetting was essential. Becker's team recruited from several sources. German émigrés who had fled the Nazi regime and were committed to its defeat provided the core talent pool. Some were professional actors or broadcasters who had worked in German radio before emigration. Others were intelligence operatives with linguistic skills who received additional training. The training program was intensive.
Performers studied recordings of actual Nazi announcers, learning to mimic their vocal patterns, pacing, and intonation. They practiced reading Nazi propaganda scripts to internalize the language and style. They learned to maintain composure during live broadcasts where mistakes could not be corrected. One particularly crucial element was voice matching. For the most effective hijacking operations, Becker wanted performers who could convincingly impersonate specific German announcers that listeners recognized and trusted. This required finding performers whose natural voices were similar to the targets and then training them to eliminate any remaining differences. The most successful voice match was a German émigré actor named Klaus, who could impersonate the primary evening news announcer for Reichssender Berlin so convincingly that even German intelligence officers who later heard recordings had difficulty distinguishing the real announcer from the impersonation. This voice-matching capability would become one of the operation's most powerful psychological weapons. When Germans heard a familiar, trusted voice reporting information that contradicted official propaganda, the cognitive dissonance created powerful doubt. Crafting the content. Becker worked closely with PWE psychological warfare specialists to develop content strategies for hijacked broadcasts. The goal was not simply to contradict Nazi propaganda, but to undermine it in ways that would be psychologically effective. Several content strategies were developed and refined through experimentation. The gradual revelation approach started with information that was verifiable or already suspected by the audience, then introduced more controversial claims only after establishing credibility. A hijacked broadcast might begin by reporting news already announced by German authorities, but then add details about casualties, resource shortages, or strategic setbacks that official reports had omitted. The insider knowledge strategy incorporated specific information that only someone with access to classified German intelligence could know. References to unit designations, officer names, operational details, and internal Wehrmacht disputes created the impression that the broadcast came from dissident elements within the German military or government, making it more credible than obvious Allied propaganda. The protective framing strategy presented subversive information in ways that protected the regime's core legitimacy while criticizing specific leaders or policies. Instead of attacking Germany or the German people, hijacked broadcasts blamed Hitler, Nazi Party leadership, and SS fanaticism for Germany's deteriorating situation. This allowed German listeners to accept the information without abandoning their national identity or military pride. The exploitation of existing doubts strategy focused on concerns that German civilians and soldiers already harbored privately but could not express publicly. Worries about food shortages, fears about Allied bombing, frustration with corrupt officials, concerns about loved ones at the front. These anxieties were real. Hijacked broadcasts validated and amplified them, making listeners feel their private doubts were shared by others and perhaps justified. Through these content strategies were tested through trial operations beginning in early 1944. Small-scale hijacking attempts targeted regional German stations with short transmissions designed to assess German responses. Intelligence gathered from prisoner interrogations, intercepted German communications, and other sources provided feedback about whether the broadcasts were being heard and believed. The results were promising. Germans who heard the hijacked broadcasts often could not determine whether they were genuine or false. The confusion itself served Allied interests by undermining confidence in all radio information. Act 3. The first major radio hijacking, turning truth into a weapon. Target selection, Reichssender Berlin. For the first major radio hijacking operation, Becker selected the most important target possible, Reichssender Berlin. This was the primary source of news for millions of Germans, the voice of authority that delivered official announcements and reported on the war's progress. Hijacking Reichssender Berlin was extraordinarily ambitious. The station broadcast with high power from central Berlin. It had the largest audience of any German station. Any successful hijacking would reach millions of people simultaneously. But the risks were equally high.
Failure would be humiliating and could expose the entire operation's capabilities. Becker's team chose the evening news broadcast on February 22, 1944, as the target. This was one of the most listened-to broadcasts in Germany, when workers had returned home and families gathered around their radios. The timing also coincided with a period of increasing German military setbacks on the Eastern Front and growing anxiety within Germany about Allied bombing campaigns. The operation was planned with military precision. Every element had to execute perfectly. The Ostbadistra transmitter would need to be tuned to the exact frequency of Reichssender Berlin. The hijacking broadcast would have to begin at the precise moment when German engineers could not quickly respond. The content would have to be convincing enough that listeners would not immediately tune away or dismiss it as obvious enemy propaganda. Becker's team rehearsed repeatedly. Klaus, the voice impersonator, practiced reading the scripted content until he could deliver it naturally and convincingly. Technical operators tested the transmission equipment to ensure it would perform under operational stress. Backup systems were prepared for every critical component. As the target date approached, tension within the operation reached its peak. Everyone involved understood that they were attempting something that had never been successfully done before at this scale. Success could open a new front in the psychological war against Nazi Germany. Failure could mean the end of the entire program.
The broadcast, February 22, 1944. On the evening of February 22nd, at exactly 7 o'clock Central European Time, millions of Germans tuned their radios to Reichssender Berlin for the evening news broadcast. The familiar opening music played. The station identification was announced. Everything seemed completely normal. The genuine Reichssender Berlin broadcast began transmitting from its Berlin studios. The regular announcer started reading the evening news bulletin. For the first few moments, German listeners heard exactly what they expected. Then, at precisely 7:03 in the evening, the Pas-de-Calais transmitter activated from its location in Sussex, England. 600 kilowatts of focused electromagnetic energy burst across the English Channel and into German airspace, targeting the exact frequency of Reichssender Berlin. The effect for German listeners was subtle at first. The broadcast continued without obvious interruption. But if someone had been listening carefully, they might have noticed a slight change in audio quality, a barely perceptible shift in the announcer's voice as the British signal overpowered the German transmission. Klaus began speaking through the hijacked signal. His voice was nearly identical to the real Reichssender Berlin announcer. His delivery matched the pacing and tone Germans expected. For the vast majority of listeners, nothing seemed amiss. They believed they were still hearing their familiar evening news broadcast. But the content was different. Klaus began reporting information that Reichssender Berlin would never broadcast. He acknowledged recent German tactical withdrawals on the Eastern Front, framing them as necessary strategic adjustments, but providing casualty figures that official reports had concealed. He mentioned specific Wehrmacht divisions that had suffered heavy losses, information that families of soldiers in those units could verify through their own tragic experiences. He reported on Allied bombing damage in German cities, not denying the raids, but describing them in greater detail than official reports allowed, including damage to specific neighborhoods and factories that listeners in those cities knew to be accurate. He discussed food and material shortages, acknowledging what every German experienced daily, but which official propaganda downplayed or blamed on temporary supply problems. Klaus's broadcast suggested these shortages reflected deeper strategic difficulties, not merely logistical challenges. Most powerfully, Klaus introduced information about Nazi Party corruption. He named specific officials alleged to be enriching themselves through black market operations, while ordinary Germans suffered rationing. He described luxurious lifestyles maintained by party leadership while soldiers died at the front.
These accusations resonated because they confirmed suspicions many Germans already harbored but could not voice publicly. The broadcast continued for 15 minutes before German engineers identified what was happening and began countermeasures. But 15 minutes was sufficient. The seed had been planted. Millions of Germans had heard truths their government had tried to hide, delivered by a voice they trusted, through a channel they believed could not be compromised. The German response. The Nazi regime's reaction to the hijacking was immediate and furious. High-level meetings were convened overnight. Goebbels' propaganda ministry issued emergency directives. German counterintelligence launched investigations to understand how the hijacking had been accomplished and how to prevent future intrusions. German technical experts quickly determined that the broadcast had come from outside Germany, most likely from Britain based on signal analysis. They calculated that an extraordinarily powerful transmitter had been required, something beyond normal broadcasting equipment. This realization was disturbing because it indicated British technical capabilities exceeding German assumptions. The Nazi response involved several elements. First, German radio engineers improved monitoring and response procedures to detect hijacking attempts faster and implement countermeasures more quickly. They increased transmitter power at major stations to make hijacking more difficult. They prepared jamming equipment to disrupt attempted hijackings. Second, the propaganda ministry issued warnings to the German public. Radio broadcasts and newspapers told citizens that Britain was attempting to deceive them by hijacking German radio frequencies. Germans were warned to be skeptical of broadcasts that seemed to contain unusual content, even if they appeared to be genuine German stations. These warnings inadvertently served Allied purposes by creating doubt about all radio information. If Germans could not trust what they heard on their own stations, how could they be certain about any broadcast? The paranoia this created undermined the regime's information control. Third, German intelligence services launched efforts to locate and destroy the transmitter responsible for the hijacking. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights searched the English coast for possible transmitter locations. German agents in Britain were tasked with gathering intelligence about British broadcasting facilities. Plans were developed for special operations to sabotage the transmitter if it could be located. These efforts failed. The Pas-de-Calais transmitter remained operational, protected by physical security, camouflage, and British counterintelligence operations that identified and neutralized German agents attempting to gather information about it. Measuring impact through intelligence. How effective was the February hijacking? Allied intelligence assessed impact through multiple sources. Prisoner interrogations provided direct feedback. German soldiers and airmen captured in subsequent weeks were questioned about their awareness of the hijacking. Many reported hearing about it, either through personal experience or through word of mouth. Some admitted being confused about whether what they heard was genuine or enemy propaganda. This confusion itself indicated the operation's psychological effectiveness. Signals intelligence intercepted German communications discussing the hijacking. These intercepts revealed that German authorities were deeply concerned about the incident and unsure how to prevent future occurrences. The level of resources devoted to investigating and countering the hijacking suggested German leadership viewed it as a significant threat. Resistance networks in occupied territories reported that the hijacking was widely discussed among German military personnel stationed across Europe. The story spread beyond those who had personally heard the broadcast, amplified by word of mouth and by subsequent Nazi warnings that inadvertently publicized the incident. Analysis of German propaganda in the weeks following the hijacking revealed changes in messaging. Nazi broadcasts became more defensive, more frequently addressing rumors and alternative narratives. This reactive posture suggested that the regime felt pressure to counter information that was circulating among the German population. Perhaps most tellingly, subsequent German propaganda directives captured by Allied intelligence showed that Nazi authorities were increasingly worried about the credibility of their own broadcasts. Internal documents discussed the need to maintain public trust in German radio, an issue that apparently had not been a significant concern before the hijacking demonstrated that trust could be undermined. All these indicators suggested that the February hijacking had achieved its objectives. It had penetrated German information defenses, delivered alternative narratives to a mass audience, created doubt about regime propaganda, and forced German authorities to expend resources on countermeasures. Becker and his team had proven that radio hijacking was not only technically possible, but strategically valuable. The question now was how to exploit this success through additional operations that would keep the Germans off balance and continue eroding confidence in Nazi information control.
Act 5. D-Day and Beyond. Hijacking at the critical moment. The Invasion Preparation Campaign. As D-Day approached in late May and early June 1944, radio hijacking became part of the final psychological warfare campaign supporting the invasion. Becker's team intensified operations, conducting multiple hijackings per week targeting different German audiences with carefully coordinated messages. The campaign had several objectives. First, reinforce the deception that the invasion would target Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. Hijacked broadcasts included references to Allied preparations in southeast England, discussions of Calais as a strategic target, and speculation about invasion timing that pointed away from the actual plan. Second, demoralize German forces stationed along the Atlantic coast. Broadcasts emphasized Allied military superiority, described the overwhelming force being assembled for invasion, and suggested that resistance would be futile and would only result in unnecessary German casualties. Third, encouraged German soldiers to consider surrender or desertion. Hijacked transmissions provided information about how to surrender safely, reassured soldiers that Allied treatment of prisoners was humane, and emphasized that surviving the war was more important than dying for a regime that was already defeated. Fourth, create confusion among German command about Allied intentions and capabilities. Disinformation about invasion plans, false reports about new weapons, and misleading intelligence about Allied order of battle all flowed through hijacked broadcasts, contributing to the overall fog of war that Operation Fortitude sought to create. The night before D-Day, June 5, 1944, Becker's team conducted one of their most ambitious operations. They hijacked multiple German stations simultaneously for extended periods, delivering coordinated messages across different regions of Germany and occupied France. The broadcasts emphasized that the long-anticipated invasion was imminent, that German defenses would be overwhelmed, and that the only rational response was to surrender rather than fight hopelessly against superior Allied forces. These broadcasts reached not only German civilians but also Wehrmacht soldiers stationed along the Atlantic Wall defenses. Many of these soldiers heard the hijacked transmissions and, in the chaos of the invasion that began hours later, some undoubtedly remembered what they had heard. The broadcasts may have contributed to the relatively rapid collapse of some German defensive positions and the higher-than-expected surrender rates in the invasion's first days. Post-invasion operations. After D-Day succeeded and Allied forces established beachheads in Normandy, radio hijacking operations continued and evolved to support the ongoing campaign in Western Europe. The focus shifted from strategic deception to tactical psychological warfare. Hijacked broadcasts targeted specific German units, named their commanders, described their situations, and encouraged them to surrender. Intelligence about German positions, strengths, and morale came from multiple sources: prisoner interrogations, signals intelligence, resistance reports, and was quickly incorporated into targeted hijacking operations. One particularly effective technique was announcing to German units that they were surrounded or that their supply lines had been cut, even when this was not yet completely accurate. These broadcasts created panic and defeatism that became self-fulfilling prophecies as units lost cohesion and fighting effectiveness. The broadcasts also targeted the German home front with increasing aggressiveness as Allied forces advanced. With Germany clearly losing the war by late summer 1944, hijacked transmissions emphasized the futility of continued resistance and the destruction that persisting would bring to German cities and civilians. After the failed assassination attempt against Hitler on July 20, 1944, hijacked broadcasts exploited the internal divisions this revealed within the German military and political establishment. Transmissions suggested that significant elements of the Wehrmacht recognized that Hitler was leading Germany to catastrophic defeat and that removing Nazi leadership was the only path to ending the war on terms that would preserve Germany's future. These messages targeted the psychological breaking point. Many Germans by late 1944 understood privately that the war was lost, but could not publicly acknowledge this reality. Hijacked broadcasts validated these suppressed beliefs and gave voice to thoughts that could not be safely expressed within Nazi Germany. The July Crisis: Amplifying Internal Division. The July 20th assassination attempt created unique opportunities for radio hijacking operations. The conspiracy against Hitler involved elements of the Wehrmacht and civilian administration who recognized that Nazi leadership was destroying Germany. Though the plot failed and conspirators would brutally purged, the incident revealed deep fissures within the German state. Becker's team moved quickly to exploit this. Within days of the assassination attempt, hijacked broadcasts were discussing the plot in detail, naming conspirators, describing their motivations, and framing them as patriots who recognized that removing Hitler was necessary to save Germany from total destruction. This framing was deliberately designed to legitimize opposition to the Nazi regime. Official Nazi propaganda portrayed the conspirators as traitors who had betrayed Germany. The hijacked broadcasts offered an alternative narrative. These were honorable men who had tried to rescue their country from a fanatical leadership driving it toward annihilation. The broadcasts also speculated about how widespread dissent within the German military and civilian establishment actually was. They suggested that the failed plot was merely the visible tip of much broader opposition, that many German officers and officials secretly agreed with the conspirators but had not openly joined the plot. This speculation served to normalize anti-Nazi sentiment and encourage others who harbored doubts to see themselves as part of a broader movement rather than isolated dissidents. German counterintelligence understood what the Allies were attempting and issued stern warnings against listening to or believing hijacked broadcasts discussing the assassination attempt. But these warnings confirmed that the broadcasts were striking sensitive targets. The more German authorities tried to suppress discussion of internal opposition, the more they inadvertently publicized that such opposition existed. Technological innovations. Frequency hopping. By late 1944, German countermeasures had become sophisticated enough that simple frequency hijacking was increasingly difficult. German stations could quickly detect intrusions and switch frequencies, limiting the duration of successful hijackings. Becker's team responded with a technological innovation: frequency hopping hijacking. This technique involved rapidly switching the hijacking transmission across multiple frequencies, following German stations as they attempted to evade, and even preemptively moving to frequencies where intelligence suggested German broadcasts would relocate. Implementing frequency hopping required advanced coordination between intelligence collection, technical operations, and broadcast production. Intelligence had to predict German frequency changes. Technical operators had to execute rapid frequency adjustments on the powerful SPD transmitter. No simple task given the equipment's complexity. Broadcast performers had to maintain continuous delivery even as the technical infrastructure shifted beneath them. When successfully executed, frequency hopping created the impression that the hijacking signal was omnipresent and inescapable. German engineers would shift their broadcast to an alternative frequency only to find the hijacking following them. This apparent inability to escape Allied radio intrusions reinforced the psychological message that German defenses were failing across all domains. The technique also multiplied the confusion for German listeners. As their radios followed German frequency changes, they would continue hearing what they believed was their regular programming without realizing they were actually tracking a hijacked signal across multiple frequencies. This seamless persistence made the hijacking nearly undetectable to casual listeners.
The final months. 1945. As 1945 began and Allied forces closed in on Germany from both east and west, radio hijacking operations reached their peak intensity. With the outcome of the war no longer in doubt, the operations shifted focus toward hastening German collapse and minimizing casualties in the war's final phase. Hijacked broadcasts in early 1945 emphasized several themes. The war was definitively lost, and continued resistance would only increase German suffering. Allied terms for surrender, while not lenient, would be far better than the complete devastation continued fighting would bring. Individual German soldiers and civilians bore no personal guilt for Nazi crimes if they now ceased supporting the regime. Surrender was not dishonorable under circumstances where further resistance served no rational military or national purpose. These messages targeted the psychology of a population and military in the final stages of collapse. Food was scarce, fuel was almost non-existent, Allied bombing had destroyed much of Germany's infrastructure, Soviet forces were advancing rapidly from the east, and American and British forces were crossing the Rhine from the west. The physical reality made continued resistance increasingly absurd. The hijacked broadcasts gave Germans permission to acknowledge what they already knew and to act on that knowledge by surrendering. In military psychology, soldiers often fight longer than rational analysis would suggest because surrender represents a personal failure, a betrayal of comrades, or an abandonment of duty. The broadcasts worked to reframe surrender as rational, honorable, and ultimately more loyal to Germany's true interests than futile continuation of a lost war. In the final weeks before Germany's surrender, hijacking operations continued until the very last days. The final hijacked broadcasts occurred in late April 1945, even as Berlin was encircled and the Nazi regime collapsed. These final transmissions announced Hitler's death, discussed the formation of a German provisional government seeking surrender terms, and urged immediate cessation of all military resistance. The legacy: from radio waves to digital warfare. Post-war assessment. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, Allied intelligence conducted comprehensive assessments of psychological warfare operations, including the radio hijacking campaign. Declassified documents from these assessments revealed the operation's impact and legacy. The assessments concluded that radio hijacking had been strategically valuable despite being impossible to precisely quantify its impact. Intelligence officers recognized that propaganda effects are inherently difficult to measure because they influence attitudes, morale, and decision-making in ways that rarely leave clear documentary trails. However, multiple indicators suggested effectiveness. Prisoner interrogations consistently revealed that German soldiers and civilians had heard hijacked broadcasts and that significant numbers had been influenced by them. German authorities had devoted substantial resources to countering the hijackings, indicating they viewed them as serious threats. The breadth and intensity of German countermeasures suggested the operations were achieving their psychological objectives. Post-war interviews with German officials and military officers provided additional insights. Many acknowledged that the hijackings had contributed to eroding confidence in Nazi propaganda and official information sources. Some admitted that hearing familiar voices and trusted stations broadcasting information that contradicted official narratives had created profound psychological dissonance that weakened their commitment to continued resistance. The assessments also noted that radio hijacking had forced Germany to divert technical and human resources to countermeasures. Engineers, equipment, and electricity devoted to radio defense represented opportunity costs, resources not available for military production or other warfighting needs. In a total war where every resource mattered, this diversion had strategic value beyond the hijacking's direct propaganda effects. Perhaps most significantly, the operation pioneered techniques that would influence psychological warfare and information operations for decades afterward. The integration of technical capability with psychological insight, the use of trusted communication channels to deliver subversive messages, and the systematic undermining of adversary information control, these approaches became standard elements of modern information warfare. The Cold War evolution. Radio hijacking techniques developed during World War II evolved and expanded during the Cold War. Both Western and Soviet intelligence services employed variations of these methods in their ongoing information warfare campaigns. The Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, and Radio Liberty broadcast to audiences behind the Iron Curtain throughout the Cold War. While these were primarily white propaganda operations openly identifying themselves as Western broadcasts, they also incorporated techniques learned from the World War II hijackings. They used native language speakers with authentic accents. They mixed verifiable news with strategic messaging. They exploited doubts and divisions within communist societies. The Soviet Union and its allies conducted their own radio operations targeting Western audiences. While less technically sophisticated than Western broadcasts, they employed similar psychological principles. They identified trusted voices and communication channels. They mixed truth with disinformation. They sought to exploit social and political divisions within Western democracies. Both sides also continued developing jamming and counter-jamming technologies, pursuing the arms race that had begun during World War II. The electromagnetic spectrum remained a battlefield where information warfare occurred daily. More directly analogous to the World War II hijackings were covert radio operations conducted by intelligence services. The CIA operated clandestine stations in various locations, sometimes claiming to be dissident groups within communist countries. The KGB similarly operated stations, presenting themselves as representing various political movements when they were actually Soviet intelligence operations. These operations never achieved the technical sophistication of directly hijacking frequencies the way Becker's team had. Cold War radio technology and countermeasures made such direct hijacking increasingly difficult. But the underlying concept, using enemy communication channels against them by creating deceptive transmissions that appeared authentic, remained a core element of psychological warfare. Modern digital warfare parallels. Today's information warfare occurs primarily in digital rather than electromagnetic space, but the principles pioneered by radio hijacking operations remain strikingly relevant. Modern cyber operations frequently involve techniques that are conceptual descendants of the World War II hijackings. Phishing operations, where malicious actors create fake emails or websites that impersonate trusted sources, employ the same fundamental deception as voice impersonation in hijacked broadcasts. The goal is identical: exploit trust in familiar channels to deliver content the target would otherwise reject. Domain hijacking and website spoofing, where cyber attackers take control of legitimate web addresses or create convincing fake versions, parallel radio frequency hijacking. The technical methods differ, but the strategic objective is the same: control communication channels to manipulate information.
Social media impersonation, where state actors or other malicious parties create fake accounts mimicking trusted individuals or organizations, represents another evolution of the voice impersonation techniques Becker's team pioneered. The medium has changed from radio to Twitter or Facebook, but the psychological exploitation remains constant. Disinformation campaigns that mix true information with strategic falsehoods to increase credibility follow the content strategies developed for hijacked broadcasts. Modern operations understand, as Becker did, that purely false information is easily dismissed, but false information embedded within verifiable truth becomes much more difficult to identify and counter. The erosion of trust in information sources, a key objective of the World War II hijackings, has become a defining characteristic of contemporary information environments. When populations cannot reliably distinguish legitimate from hijacked or spoofed communications, the resulting confusion serves the interests of those who benefit from informational chaos. Modern democracies face challenges analogous to those the Nazi regime confronted when attempting to counter Allied radio hijacking. How do you maintain information integrity when adversaries can create convincing fake versions of trusted sources? How do you help populations distinguish truth from sophisticated deception? How do you defend information spaces without implementing controls that undermine the openness that democracies require? These questions that emerged from World War II radio battles remain among the most pressing challenges of contemporary information warfare.
Becker's legacy. Thomas Becker, the engineer and intelligence operative whose vision and technical genius created the radio hijacking program, remained with British intelligence after the war. His work stayed classified for decades, with his contributions known only to a small circle of intelligence professionals. As declassification gradually revealed the hijacking operations, Becker's innovations received recognition from historians and intelligence scholars. He is now remembered as a pioneer of technical information warfare who understood that controlling communication channels was as strategically important as controlling physical territory. Becker's approach combined multiple disciplines in ways that were unusual for his era. He was simultaneously an engineer solving technical problems, a psychologist understanding human perception and belief, a strategist thinking about how information operations served military objectives, and an artist appreciating the performative elements of effective deception. This multidisciplinary integration, technical skill married to psychological insight, operational planning combined with creative execution, became a model for subsequent information warfare operations. Modern cyber operations, psychological warfare campaigns, and influence operations all require similar integration of diverse expertise. The broader lesson from Becker's work is that information itself is a domain of warfare as important as land, sea, or air. Control over what populations believe, how they perceive reality, and what narratives they accept fundamentally shapes political and military outcomes. This understanding, which seems obvious in our contemporary digital age, was genuinely revolutionary in the 1940s. Radio hijacking demonstrated that seemingly secure communication systems could be compromised not through force, but through technical sophistication and psychological manipulation. This insight applies equally to modern information infrastructures. No system is truly secure if an adversary has sufficient technical capability and strategic creativity. Conclusion: the frequency of truth. Decoding the full operation. We return now to our opening scene, a German civilian listening to what they believe is Reichssender Berlin, hearing familiar voices delivering unfamiliar truths. Now we understand what was truly happening. That hijacked broadcast represented an extraordinary integration of technical innovation, intelligence collection, psychological warfare, and operational courage. It required a transmitter more powerful than any that had existed before. It demanded performers who could convincingly impersonate trusted voices. It needed intelligence about German broadcasting sufficient to replicate their production style and content perfectly.
It depended on psychological understanding of how to penetrate propaganda conditioning without triggering immediate rejection. The operation succeeded because one visionary engineer, Thomas Becker, understood that radio was more than a technology. It was a trust relationship between broadcasters and audiences. Hijacking the technology meant hijacking the trust. And once that trust was compromised, the entire information control structure that Nazi propaganda depended upon began to crumble. Millions of Germans heard these hijacked broadcasts. Most probably never consciously recognized them as enemy propaganda. Many simply absorbed information that created doubt, that validated suppressed concerns, that made the official narrative less credible. The cumulative psychological impact contributed to the erosion of German morale and the ultimate collapse of the Nazi regime. At Cipher Tales, we decode operations where propaganda and espionage merged into tools that changed history's course. Radio hijacking exemplifies this merger perfectly. The operation appeared to be simple propaganda, delivering messages to enemy populations, but it was actually sophisticated espionage, gathering intelligence about German broadcasting, infiltrating communication systems, and manipulating trust relationships from within. The propaganda enabled espionage, and the espionage enabled propaganda, creating a synergy more powerful than either could achieve independently. The hijacked broadcasts existed in multiple contexts simultaneously. As propaganda, they demoralized German audiences and undermined Nazi information control. As technical operations, they demonstrated capabilities that forced German countermeasures. As psychological warfare, they exploited cognitive vulnerabilities and trust relationships. Each function reinforced the others. The modern relevance. This story from World War II speaks directly to our contemporary moment. We live in an information environment where distinguishing authentic from deceptive communication grows increasingly difficult. Trust in traditional information sources has eroded. Sophisticated actors routinely hijack communication channels, impersonate trusted voices, and manipulate information ecosystems. The techniques have evolved from radio to digital platforms, but the underlying principles remain constant. Whoever controls communication channels controls narratives. Whoever can convincingly impersonate trusted sources can manipulate populations. The defense against such manipulation requires the same multidisciplinary thinking that Becker brought to offensive information warfare. Technical security must be combined with media literacy. Population education must be paired with system integrity. Open societies must develop resilience against information manipulation without abandoning the openness that defines them. This story from World War II, radio hijacking, reminds us that information warfare is not a new phenomenon invented by the digital age. The battles for control over narratives, the struggles to distinguish truth from sophisticated deception, the challenges of maintaining information integrity in adversarial environments, these have existed as long as mass communication technologies have existed. What changes across time are the technical capabilities and the communication channels. The fundamental dynamics of trust, deception, psychological manipulation, and information control remain remarkably constant. In our next upload on Cipher Tales, we decode the forged Nazi documents that fooled Hitler's inner circle. You will discover how Allied intelligence created paperwork so perfect that even the most paranoid Nazi security systems accepted it as genuine. If this deep dive into the spy who hijacked World War II radio propaganda fascinated you, please subscribe to Cipher Tales for more decoded mysteries from the hidden history of World War II. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our next upload. Like this video if you found it revealing and thought-provoking. Every like helps us reach more people who appreciate the complex, hidden dimensions of history. Comment below and tell us, were you surprised by the sophistication of World War II information warfare? Do you see parallels between radio hijacking and modern cyber operations? What other World War II propaganda and espionage intersections should we decode next? Share this video with anyone fascinated by intelligence history. information warfare, or the hidden technical battles that shaped our world. Until then, remember, the most powerful weapon is sometimes not the bullet or the bomb, but the trusted voice delivering an untrusted truth. This has been Cipher Tales. Keep questioning, keep decoding, keep discovering the secrets that changed history.